Hello, everybody. Welcome to Lit Fic on the Mighty Blaze. I am Bo Ellis, Facebook director of The Blaze, their producer. I'm an unpublished writer myself, and I bribed Carolyn Levitt into giving me this slot. The Blaze was sparked in 2020 when COVID extinguished the traditional in-person book tour. Our New York Times bestselling author co-founders Jenna Bloom and Caroline Levitt joined forces to promote new books coming out for authors. This week, we have the amazing Allison Gilbert to talk about her new book, Listen World, about the amazing Elsie Robin. Hello, Allison.
Hey, I'm so excited to join you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we'll get right into it with the first, perhaps obvious question, which is, why Elsie Robinson?
Wow, she was a dynamo. In her day, she became the highest paid woman writer in the entire William Randolph Hearst media empire. She had more than 20 million readers, which is incredible if you think about it, because even today, that is double the number of subscribers that the New York Times has. And she had America's attention. She, for more than 30 years, wrote a column called Listen World, which is where we got the name of our biography from. It was her amazing column, and she wrote about everything. And so we have her voice, and we know what she had to say about some of the most pressing topics and issues of her day. And she was just a badass.
Absolutely. This is the cover for it. It looks
There it is.
amazing. If my copy's a little rough looking, it's because I was taking it absolutely everywhere because I just couldn't put it down. So it came with me on the bus to work, just everywhere.
Oh, that is so great to hear. Thank you for sharing that.
Yes. So, how did you discover Elsie Robinson?
Well, it was a very strange and unexpected story. Like you and everybody else, from the New York Times to the Washington Post, the headlines are Elsie Robinson, who? And I said Elsie Robinson, who, as well, before I found out who she was. My mother died nearly 30 years ago. And when I was cleaning out my mother's belongings, I found a folded up piece of paper inside a book that had belonged to my mom. And it fell out of a book that I was packing up after she died. I was packing up my childhood home. And it was the best poem, the most tough love poem about grief I had ever read. And it was attributed to someone named Elsie Robinson. And I had to know who she was. And it put me on this journey.
That is really amazing. I never would have guessed that story. It shows that Elsie really is somebody who can speak to us even now.
Oh, 100%. There was something about that poem. It was called Pain, that was about grief and loss, that appealed to my mother when she came across that poem, I'm guessing in the 1950s. Elsie Robinson died in 1956. And the
Wow.
book where I found it, this folded up piece of paper, it was inscribed as a gift to my mom from her college roommate, and it was given to her at about the same time. So I'm putting it two to two together. I even asked my mom's college roommate, what do you think about this poem? So resonated with my mom. I wanted to know because, of course, this journey has made me feel so close to my mom, not knowing what it was about Elsie Robinson that appealed to her. So in the writing of this biography, I felt so incredibly close to my mom, and she had died so long ago. So it's a real gift.
That's so amazing to hear about. And I'm glad that this book could have such a personal connection. And I could tell reading it that this book was written with a lot of love for Elsie, but just love in general.
I have so much love for Elsie. There was not a single article that Julia Shears, my co-author, and I read. We did some math and we did some database work, and we compiled In all, there were about 9,000 columns, essays, articles, poems that Elsie wrote during her career. And throughout the structure of this biography that we wrote, Listen World, which, by the way,
Mhm.
is the first of Elsie Robinson ever
Mhm.
written, we wanted to make sure Elsie's voice was clear, and a lot of it would be existing on the page of this book. And so when you read it, it's not just the author's voice that you will hear. Of course,
Mhm.
we provide the context and we provide some historical
Mhm.
perspective, but it's Elsie Robinson's story. And so since Elsie Robinson was a writer of the most prolific kind,
Mhm.
we're able to include her voice in a really big, demonstrable way throughout the entire narrative. And so you'll hear from the authors, us, but
Mhm.
you'll also hear so much about Elsie from herself, because who is better to tell a woman's story than the woman who actually lived it? So it's been a real joy.
No, and that is when Elsie Robinson, she, like you said, she was so prolific. She was the highest paid woman at Hearst. She had this amazing, incredible life story, and she was a fantastic writer. And even today, her writing absolutely holds up. So, why do you think that she's been forgotten in modern times?
Oh my gosh, there are so many reasons, and we
Mhm.
try to explain some of them at the
Mhm.
end of the book. Like, what was our thinking about why
Mhm.
Elsie Robinson has been forgotten? And one reason that we could talk about here, which I find really compelling, is that the National Women's History Museum has done an
Mhm.
exhaustive study about how our kids learn social studies, how our students in this country learn history. And
Mhm.
what they found when they looked at kindergarten through 12th grade in the United States, that of all the historical figures that are taught, only 24% are women.
Wow, that's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. And so
Mhm.
if you want students to learn about women's histories, you have
Mhm.
to teach women's histories. And of course, there's lots of reasons why this has been allowed to happen, and we can certainly explore that if you want. I find it very compelling and interesting to
Mhm.
understand the logic behind of it, if you call it logic, but there is a
Yes.
reason behind it. But if you're not learning the history, when it goes to write a
Mhm.
school report, you're not gonna know there was an Elsie
Mhm.
Robinson to begin with. And that's just in high school or middle school. And then when you go, let's say, to college, you can't write a final paper about someone who you don't know. And to take
Mhm.
that further, you can't write a thesis and you can't build a doctorate for that either. And so you could see how something so small explodes in its importance in terms of how women's histories are just forgotten.
Mhm. And that makes it so tragic for all the other amazing women who are out there who just don't have their stories being told.
There
And
has been, yes, I agree with you, Bo. There has been a steady
Mhm.
erasure of women's history. And
Mhm.
we hope, Julia Shears and I hope, she's my co-author of this book, that
Mhm.
not only do we hope to elevate Elsie Robinson's legacy with
Mhm.
this biography, Listen World, but we hope that it serves as a beacon. What other stories are out there that we can hopefully shine the light on, or at least stir the pot to get people interested in kind of
Mhm.
pulling back the curtain of where these other stories are hidden. So we hope that it sparks a wave. We hope that it just is another flame that we can ignite.
Absolutely, because women, and this leads into my next question, but throughout history, we've been trying to erase women. Certainly, a lot of people in Elsie's life did not love how outspoken, how forward thinking, and how strong she was. So, how do you think she kept that real strength, kept that drive when she had a lot of unfortunate circumstances happen, a lot of people against her, and just lived in a world that was meant to prevent women like her from even existing?
Elsie Robinson had incredible moxie. She also had incredible self-confidence. Now, we can go back and we can look at her childhood and we can say that she is one of 5 children, and so she had to even fight for attention, let's say, at the
Mhm,
dinner table. We can talk to how she, spoke about her own father in her words, treated her as her brothers, and expected as much out of her at the turn of the 20th century as he did her male siblings. And so the
mhm,
expectations for her in the Robinson household were not somehow smaller because she was born female. She did experience real obstacles in her life because the expectations of her outside of those 4 walls were so painfully limited. She
mhm,
couldn't go to college. Her parents at that time informed her that they just couldn't afford it. And so the only option to her, she graduated high school in 1900. And in that time, what she described as the only options available to her was marriage and having children, which, by the way, she went down that path and she found the birth of her son thrilling, but also she wanted more. It wasn't
mhm,
that it wasn't enough. He was everything to her. She loved being a mom, but she also wanted the and. What
mhm,
else? What else can I find fulfilling? And for her, it was writing.
mhm. Which is amazing. And it's also great to highlight that she did love her son and that motherhood was great for her, but she was a mother and so much more. Like so many other women probably wanted to be, but didn't get that opportunity. Like,
Yeah,
mhm,
she talked about that all the time. She
mhm,
wanted there to be motherhood, and she wasn't disparaging of
mhm,
motherhood. She loved her son George more than
mhm,
anything. They were this incredible close-knit pair, but she also wanted this bigger, most fulfilling life. One of her most famous quotes, and I'll paraphrase it, so it's not probably completely word for word, but she questioned, it was something like, why is it that women who become wives stop living this fuller life when men who become husbands can still go out and do the many things that brought them joy
mhm,
before they were husbands? And so she really saw this difference. And this was well before, women got the right to vote. This is well
mhm,
before Gloria Steinem was even born. I mean, she was one of the original progressive women thinkers. And so this was in print, national attention
mhm.
towards these very progressive views.
No, and that is just fantastic that we have Elsie to kind of look back on. And do you think that we as modern people now, especially modern women's movements, could learn from learning about Elsie or just from her life?
I, of course, think so. There is
Mhm,
so much about what she had to say in her columns that are instructive today, but even more so, we haven't talked about this yet. She
mhm,
was a double threat. The reason why she commanded such a high salary, the reason why William Randolph Hearst made her his highest paid woman writer is because she was also an exceptional artist. She also drew her own editorial cartoons. And so that made her even more powerful because if you were illiterate, you could
mhm,
still get the point of many of her columns just by looking at the art that she created to accompany them. And it's remarkable because usually writers write and artists illustrate. And
mhm,
normally, what happens is that a writer, that column is sent to the art department. And then an artist who did not write the column then creates the illustration to go with that point of view. Elsie did both, and she
mhm.
is one of the first and only columnists in the country to do both jobs.
Wow. It is. Elsie has such a fantastic life that I'm so glad that you are just shedding light on and that we get to shed more light on with this interview, because it's, I think, just so sad that we just don't hear about her. Like you said, in these social studies classes, we could absolutely learn. And here was the highest paid woman at Hearst, one of the first female columnists, and yet, I definitely never learned about her in any of my lessons.
What I find so remarkable about her too is that, we talk today about side hustles and going after your dreams and doing it before work or after work, but we haven't talked about the part of her life that became before she was famous. She hit rock bottom. She was a single mother. She left her husband because he was holding her back from living this bigger life that she wanted. And with her son in tow for 3 years, she worked in a gold mine in California, 600 feet below the surface of the earth, really risking her life nearly every single day, walking 4 miles to the mine, toiling all day long, running away from dynamite blasts. I mean, she literally could have been killed at any minute during these 3 years, walking 4 miles back to her cabin with her son. And then only after he was in bed at night, can you imagine how tiring this was? Only
Yeah.
after he was in bed did she take out a manual typewriter, and by candlelight, we're talking 1915 to 1918, she started typing out her manuscripts and then walking them to the one post office in town, to the publishers in New York and Boston, to get her first writing gigs. I mean, it's incredible.
It is. Elsie is really, she's emblematic of that kind of story that we see so often, where it's, the person who's lost everything, and it's not like she had a lot to begin with. Like you said, she couldn't even attend college, and yet we don't, see a bunch of documentaries on her when she has this inspiring story of that kind of true rags to riches through line. Also, this is Mary. He's
Oh,
unofficial
hello,
Blaze cat.
hi. Oh my gosh, what kind of cat is that?
He's just domestic long hair, so he's a regular old fluffy boy.
Oh, he's so cute. Oh my gosh.
Yes. But yes.
So cute. Oh my gosh. It's been a real pleasure to resurrect Elsie Robinson's story, because I find that there's so many obstacles that she overcame that I think are so relatable today. We just talked about how she did her side hustle at night after she was
Yes.
so exhausted, but we open Listen World intentionally with this one scene back in 1940 where she was taking William Randolph Hearst to task in a way that I probably wouldn't even talk to my boss today, telling him that she needs more money, that he hadn't given her a raise in 9 years, that she needed to work, in our words today, remotely, that she didn't need to go into the newsroom as much as he was requiring of her. And I find that the fact that she was so direct and was willing and able and did take on the country's most powerful publisher, meaning Hearst, her boss, in such a deliberate, proactive way, is something that we today can really look to as being an example of how to advocate for yourself in a business setting. She fought for what she was worth, and she put it in writing, and then she gathered evidence of her success. So then Hearst would have no other choice. Right after she, this is a really funny story.
Yeah.
After she advocated for herself in 1940, I need more money, I haven't gotten a raise, all these things. He threw her this enormous luncheon in her honor at the Warwick Hotel in New York City.
Wow.
So he knew he needed to keep her happy.
That is so inspiring, just the way that she was able to, like you said, just advocate for herself. There's so many people who now are scared to do that. And Ivana said, I know nothing of this woman and now cannot wait to read the book. That is amazing.
Oh, good. Oh, well, once you get it, please, email me and let me know what you think.
Yes, and thank you for being here, Ivana. But do you feel that you personally learned anything from Elsie, or maybe were inspired by this force of will that she had, because she really did?
100%. We created a database, the
Mhm,
first one ever created, of Elsie Robinson's quotes, what she
mhm,
had to say about feminism, motherhood, raising kids, parenthood, communism, capitalism, anti-Semitism, racism. I mean, talk
mhm,
about any topic under the sun. 9,000 pieces of writing in
mhm,
a 35 plus year career is a lot of her words to pull on. And she talked about not hanging on to hate as one thing that I've really, letting things go. She talked about always being proactive about things that you want out of life and not being
mhm,
on the sidelines. There were a lot of lessons. We talked when we first started about how I learned about Elsie Robinson, and it was
mhm,
only because my mother had passed away. And I feel like some of the advice, some of the lessons, some of Elsie Robinson's words spoke to me, especially because I had lost my mom. And her
mhm,
advice felt almost maternal. It felt very straightforward. She
mhm,
was really not very mushy and soft. She was very plain spoken and unapologetic. Her
mhm.
opinions are blistering in many ways, don't you think? I mean, you read the
Yes.
book. I think her
Oh, yes.
are they're not soft pedaled.
She stated what she thought, and she didn't couch it or try to backpedal and be like, "Oh, well, that's just my opinion." She was like, "Nope, this is what I think."
This is the way it is. We talked about that poem I first found, and it was about
Mhm,
grief, just to give people a sense of her tone.
mhm,
Basically, this poem about grief, the message was basically, yes, you have lost your mom. In this case, that's how I was reading because my mom had just died. And her
mhm,
tone was, be lucky, feel lucky that you had a mother who was worth missing. Meaning, suck it up and feel gratitude that
mhm,
you had a mom who is worth missing. And that's really Elsie Robinson's tone. It's suck
mhm,
it up, move forward. How can you put one foot in front of the other? And so many of her comments, so many of her lessons are exactly in that tone. And I felt that I could absorb them for my very own mothering, from my
yeah,
very own wifing, in my household with
mhm,
my husband. I mean, they're very practical. And yet, also, there was distance too when she starts talking about racism and how she experienced it in this country, or anti Semitism here at
mhm.
home during World War II. It could have been written yesterday.
Yes. And it is amazing to have a woman from that long ago who really has what we would consider very modern ideas, and to know that people were always questioning these things. And it is also just a beautiful perspective on grief to instead reflect on how grateful you are that you had just anyone like that in your life who impacted you so much.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many parts of Elsie
Mhm,
Robinson's story that I feel like were really surprising when we were writing this book. We talked about Elsie when she was a gold miner for 3 years,
yeah.
but we also didn't talk about when she got her very first job. Her very first job was as a children's writer and illustrator at the Oakland Tribune. And how did she get that job? It wasn't from connections. It wasn't because she was rich and she knew the editor. No, She went with what she knew. She had always drawn cartoons for her son. She'd always written him out stories to entertain him. Again, he was born in 1904. They didn't have TV or an iPad for entertainment. She was writing up stories for him to kind of keep him occupied. And she took what she knew and she went into the Oakland Tribune and said, look, you don't have a children's section. Every other paper in the Bay Area, in San Francisco, they have a children's section. I've identified your weak spot. Let me fill it. And she did.
Yeah, which reading that part, I was also like, that is just so smart, so bold to say, here's what you need, and I am the one who can do that for you.
Yeah, she did that, by the way, in 1918. So I feel like there are all these examples of her living her best life, her going after this career that she wanted desperately because that filled her up, that made her feel complete. And she wasn't going to take no for an answer. And she started with how many writers begin, with what she knew, with what she was experiencing. And then her career exploded.
Yes. And we also have an audience question. So I'll put that up.
Oh,
of one asking, what years did she write for Hearst papers?
Elsie Robinson was hired in 1924, and she wrote until her death in 1956. That is a huge, long run. In fact, I will say this, Elsie Robinson was such a workaholic that even after she died in 1956, her column kept running because she had already submitted content, articles before deadline. And so they had Elsie Robinson columns continue well after she died because she already wrote them and they were in the can.
And that, again, that work ethic is just amazing.
I mean, that's incredible. I mean, she was, I hate to say it because it sounds so trite to say. She was a blogger before bloggers existed. She wrote sometimes 6 days a week. And the pace was relentless. From 1924 to 1956, that entire time she worked for Hearst.
Which, that's a length of a career that can definitely be envied, even for journalists today, to just...
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It was incredible. So thank you for that question. I love that question. And she was nationally syndicated even before she went to Hearst. Starting in 1921, for 3 years, she was nationally syndicated by another outfit. And then she was brought to New York, put up at the Plaza Hotel, and wooed by Hearst to come work for the entire Hearst empire. So that was quite extraordinary.
It's just great to see that at the time, even though things were what they were, which were not perfect, that she managed to show everyone her worth and had it respected to the point where even Hearst, as you opened the book with, knew like, oh, I cannot afford to lose Elsie Robinson.
Yeah, it was incredible. In fact, we created, if folks want to go check it out. So on my website, AllisonGilbert.com, you'll have a little bit of a synopsis of the book and the normal kind of author things that are on the book. But on ElsieRobinson.com, we created a very short, believe me, it won't take you very long to look at, with great photos, a timeline of her professional highlights. So if you want to kind of see a very quick overview of Elsie Robinson's work career, her writing career, go to ElsieRobinson.com.
That is awesome. Thank you for sharing that resource so we can all explore a little more.
Yeah, the timeline was fun to put together. I didn't want to create a timeline that was really bogged down and like she was born on this day and then she went to school. It's really just the highlights because I know that people want things that are condensed. What are the completely most essential points? And so you'll get it by looking at it just for a few minutes.
Awesome. And why do you think, with Elsie being so prolific, and I know you addressed this a little in the book, but given how popular, well-read she was, how long her articles went, why do you think her works were never really properly archived in the way that some other authors and journalists received?
Well, I don't think Elsie Robinson gets a free pass. She didn't donate her own papers to an archive. She didn't collect her articles and put them into a library near where she died, nor where she was born. So I don't want to give her a free pass. Yes, it's true. The Hearst Corporation didn't consolidate her work under one umbrella, but neither did other papers that she had worked for before she got to Hearst. So there's no disparagement to the Hearst Corporation. That wasn't done. You know, I think when we think of saving documents now, it's a little bit different because things can be digitized. It's
Mhm.
another thing when it was just newspaper print after newspaper print. I mean, that's a lot of paper to save from 1924 to
Mhm.
1956. But yet, her longhand, her other writing, her correspondence, we had to go find those and do our digging into archives to find the correspondence between her and William Randolph Hearst, between Elsie Robinson and her other editors, which we have
Mhm.
done. But I don't think Elsie gets a free pass. And I feel like that's kind of important for the rest of us to consider, which is how do we want to be remembered?
Mhm.
How are we amassing our own papers? Do we have a plan for where our longhand is going to go? I think it's easy to say that it's partially her fault because I think that she would likely, possibly, in looking back over how she was forgotten for so many years, she might agree that she bears some of that responsibility. I think she does.
Mhm. And that definitely tracks in that it's a lot, we curate our own legacy. And it might be she wasn't thinking of that while she was living, but I'm glad that you and Julia Shears, your co author, made such an effort to do that digging so we could have this amazing biography of this amazing woman.
Thank you so much. And, Julia and I made a great dynamo pair. This book would not be the book without Julia. I'm just so thrilled that we got to collaborate on this book. And I will say one last thing about the archival research. As biographers, normally your first stop is to go to the repository where the Elsie Robinson papers are, right? If you were going to research, we've been talking about William Randolph Hearst, his papers exist at the Bancroft Library, not Elsie Robinson's papers. But for us, what we had to do as biographers is reverse engineer her life. And so we had to do that through the men who employed her. So, in order to find those letters between Elsie Robinson and William Randolph Hearst, we went to the Hearst archives, where the Elsie Robinson's letters were never appreciated by other biographers because they didn't know who Elsie Robinson was.
Mhm.
And so we had to go through her male employers. So whether it's William Randolph Hearst or Arthur Brisbane or Fremont Older, these are all of her bosses. And then those men's archives, we found evidence of Elsie's professional life, not because there was an Elsie Robinson repository. And so
Mhm.
it just goes to show even more how important it is for all of us to be responsible, I think, for
Yeah.
our own legacies.
And that's, I think, an excellent lesson for anyone also to take away is that if you want this to be your legacy, just start building it as soon as you possibly can.
Yeah, I mean, Elsie has been this incredible woman to live with and think about and
Mhm.
get to know. And I feel like I'm a smarter human for having read so much of her
Mhm.
writing. And by the way, I'll say one last thing. is that we know for sure that nobody in their right mind is going to do as much Elsie Robinson reading as we have to create this biography. And that's why we kept her voice so present throughout the entire book. I think you would agree, Bo. That's not just one quote or two quotes. I mean, Elsie Robinson is nearly a co-author of this biography because there's so much of her voice that she gets to tell so much of her own story.
No, and that is one thing I really loved about reading this, was getting to just see how it felt almost crazy that she had like a quote for almost every situation, it felt like. And to really get like, oh, this is something that is absolutely her opinion, her thoughts, and we're getting to just see her own story through her words, which we so rarely get to see.
Yes, and especially we've been talking about how women have been erased in so many forms. Their stories have been erased. And so as two women writers, to not let the subject of our biography, Elsie Robinson, not have an equal platform, so to speak, to us, felt like we weren't doing her justice. And so that's how we shaped the book. And I think it was a good choice.
Yeah, and we have another audience question from Ivana. Does she have any living relatives?
Yes, she does. And in fact, we started our book tour in California. And what was so exciting at the Oakland Public Library, one of her relatives surprised us, and they were in the audience. We had been corresponding by email and by phone and by text, and they really helped us with our research, but they didn't tell us they were actually going to be in the audience, and they were, and it was so exciting for us. And they had actually found new photographs that they hadn't even seen, even while we were doing the reporting of the book. It was just so exciting.
That is such a lovely surprise to just show up there for you guys.
Yeah, we got a lot of surprises. There were a lot of people who helped us do the research of this book. People who are in the local tax assessor's office who could help us retrace when Elsie owned certain properties, let's say in San Francisco, or people who were in the California State Geologist's office who helped us understand the mines and where Elsie worked in the state of California. These people, Bo, showed up to so many of our book signings so far because they had a stake in the research. They were so helpful to us. And a lot of it happened during COVID. And so we couldn't get to certain libraries and archives. And so these men and women, these librarians, these curators, these archivists were just our right and left hands. We would be completely dead in the water if we didn't get their help. And the fact that they've come to all these in-person book events, and hopefully more to come, it'll just be really exciting to meet them all in person.
That is amazing. And it's great that they are just showing up and that you had the opportunity to have this collaboration.
Well, I think it goes to show, I think that they felt a stake in the resurrection of Elsie Robinson's story. We kind of have informally dubbed all of us Team Elsie, that we feel like we are responsible for ensuring that this incredible woman with this really unbelievably inspiring story, that her memory endures. And so once you read it, join Team Elsie. Help us amplify her story and make sure more people know about it.
Absolutely. And there's so much to know, but what do you think is one thing that everybody should know about Elsie?
That no matter what you want to do in your life, whether or not it's to be a parent, whether or not it's to be a writer, the way Elsie wanted to be a writer, whatever it is your life's goal, nobody is going to roll out the welcome mat for you. It's going to be difficult. But if you have the moxie, if you have the determination, and you should, Elsie would say, then you should go for it, even without that person who can bring you along by the hand, even if you don't have someone whose hand you can take, who can bring you along. Fight for the destiny that's yours. I believe that's what she would say. That's how she lived her life. And I feel like she would say that's possible for anyone who has that vision, that goal. And I feel it's really inspiring.
That is, I mean, I feel inspired just hearing that, honestly. That's truly advice that we should all, I think, live by.
I do too. Listen, she
Mhm.
was dirt poor. She had
Yeah.
no connections. She was branded, back in the
Mhm.
day, to leave your husband, to be divorced, um, was many people thought, and maybe still do, think it's a sin.
Mhm.
People would rather be known as a widow than to admit that they were divorced back in the day.
Mhm.
And without money and without connections and with this shame that she carried, in her words, of
Mhm.
divorce, she soldiered on and she went for what she wanted and she got it. And she became the most read woman in the entire country.
Yeah. Which that's just it's something that I'm very glad that I can even be part of it. I definitely consider myself Team Elsie now. that,
Yay!
that
That's awesome.
yes, that this story can be spread and hopefully other people can get that same inspiration from her.
Yay, join Team Elsie. Awesome.
Yes. We're getting close to the end of our time, so
Yes,
I wanted
yes.
to ask, what are you doing next and how can people follow you?
I am doing nothing but making sure more people join Team Elsie. If you go to my website, AllisonGilbert.com,
Mhm.
you'll see a very prominent events tab. I am
Mhm.
going everywhere to do events. Tomorrow, I'll be in New Jersey at Watchung Booksellers. I'm going to
Mhm.
be with a wonderful New York Times writer, and I cannot wait to be in conversation. Totally excited about that. In a few weeks, I'm going to be at the New York Public Library, at the New York Historical Society,
Mhm.
back down to DC at Politics and Prose in January, Greedy Reads in Baltimore. I mean, there's so many more. Please go on my website, join me. Many more events also online.
Mhm.
The Society of Illustrators is coming up, and we're going to be talking about Elsie Robinson's. We talked briefly about her editorial
Mhm.
cartoons. I'm not naming all the events enough. I cannot
Yeah.
commit them all to
Mhm.
memory, nor bore everyone who is on this line right now, of course, who's live right now. So go to my
Mhm.
events page and please join Team Elsie and join us.
Absolutely. And for the last question, is there anything I didn't ask about that I should have or that you'd like to talk about?
I'm going to ask you a question.
Ooh.
What was your favorite part of Elsie Robinson's story?
Oh, that is so difficult. I think part of it was just reading about those years as a minor, because when you hear about coal mines, it's even brought up now as like this was a thing men did, that men did this and the women stayed home. But it's just not entirely true that women went out, they were doing that too. And we've kind of it's just again on that erasure. We've erased them from that. I mean, women have always been, and as Elsie said, women are made of the same stuff as men, made to do the same things. So really, just the way she showed that even in the 1900s, a time we wouldn't think of it about, women were always doing the same things as men. They were always pushing, and maybe not as many got as far as Elsie did, but I'm sure a lot others had that spirit that we just haven't heard of either.
Yeah, I think her time in the gold mines at the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, it could have been the worst time of her life.
Mhm.
But what she said instead, as I'm sure you'll remember, Bo, it was the best time of her life because she felt that she could be 100% herself. She could be authentic and not put on airs and not have to play the role of a pretty woman
Yeah.
who was delicate and a mincing flower, as she would say, that she could be just as bold and just as physical as a man. And so for her, the worst time of her life, the time where she could have been the most low, was actually the best time and informed the rest of her life.
And that is also another inspiring lesson to take away.
Yes.
Yes. And so with that, thank you all for joining us on Lit Fic. Thank you, Allison Gilbert, for this amazing interview.
Oh
And
my gosh, thank you.
Yes, everybody go out, get Listen World, join Team Elsie, and definitely follow Allison to all of her events. And thank you all. We will see you next week. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.